I met Susan last year. She was my boss last year. She's a wonderful person to work with, and she'll be kicking us off on the speakers today. Susan?
It's terrific to be here. We'll see if I can get my talk up. There we go. So I'm delighted to be here to learn from all of you and to celebrate all of the great progress that you've made with STEP. My goal is really to just give you a little bit of an overview about where we're going with STEP and STEM education in DUE as a warm-up, and then I have the great pleasure of introducing Joe Handelsman, who is the main event this morning. So we live at a time where there is all sorts of disruptive change, right? The world of MOOCs. Who ever heard of the White House having education data jams and data paloozas and dealing with all the challenges of data privacy, issues on how do we deal with the rising cost of college, how do we deal with access issues, how do we deal with the changing face of colleges and universities in higher education, and in all of this, how do we integrate what we are learning about how students learn? So lots of change across the country and here in DC and here in NSF. And one of the changes I'm sure some of you have pondered is what's happening with STEP as we move into the future. So one of my key messages is that all of the goals that you have all collectively worked so hard on are central to the forward momentum at the NSF. And so the good work that you're doing to increase the number of high-quality STEM graduates is central to the ongoing efforts, as are the integration of these evidence-based activities, looking at how you fit all the pieces together for maximum effect. And then all of you are working on institutional change, right? So it's the beautiful thing about STEP are all the strategies you are developing to ensure the ongoing success of future students at your institution long after you've moved on beyond this current STEP grant. So these goals align with many of the recommendations that are coming out of key reports that are driving policy in Washington. In just a few minutes, you'll get to hear from Jo about the wonderful work she co-chaired with the PCAST Engage to Excel study, really pushing on building our capacity to graduate 1 million new STEM workers in the next decade. And one of the key ways is implementing evidence-based practices. A study out of the academies really pushes on what do we actually know about approaches to improving undergraduate STEM learning in science and engineering. And this has driven a number of federal responses. So I wanted to point to the just completed CrossAgency priority goals. So across the agencies, there are a number of priority goals driven through the White House each year. And in 2013, undergraduate education and pushing again on the quality and quantity of STEM grads was a high priority. And Joan Farini Mundi, our AD in Education and Human Resources at NSF, led this particular goal, and you'll get to hear from her during the noon hour. STEP has been right there with work totally aligned with this goal and effort. Many of you are aware of the special focus within STEP last year to particularly push on engineering and computer science. A couple really terrific examples that came out of this collaboration with Intel and GE point to experiments that are very different in nature and are likely to be very successful in achieving the STEP goals. So out in California with computer science, Hartnell College and Cal State Monterey Bay have partnered to create a 3-year computer science degree, recognizing that for low-income students, even with scholarships, it's really difficult to stay in school for a full 4 years, and they're working on ways to get students well prepared in a shorter amount of time. Further up the West Coast, Washington State and the University of Washington have partnered with engineering in a redshirt model, just like in sports. And sometimes, a little extra time a year out in the beginning can lead to incredible success. So many students come from under-resourced high schools. They don't have AP programs, and they walk into an engineering program, walk into calculus class, and their classmates, some at 4s and 5s on AP Calc, and they're taking it again just to make sure they really understand it well. Not a very level playing field. So using that first year to really help all students get up to speed so they can be successful in that program. Another really interesting part of this effort with GE and Intel, and I see my colleague Don Millard in the back of the room, you might want to talk with him, he's certainly taken the lead on this. We're working on an I-Core model specifically for learning, helping PIs take their best efforts and figure out how they can actually get spread and uptake in a very broad way, modeled after and building on the I-Core model for scaling other kinds of innovations. And I believe Joan will tell you a little bit more about that also. But there was a meeting ASEE helped us with last week, and you might want to talk to Don. Other things that are going on within our STEP portfolio all point to the success you're collectively having in increasing retention, one of the biggest challenges we face in the country. So here's an example, and I'll just share 2 of them, and you have your own data that you can, sit there and just privately pat yourself on the back as well. In the University of Central Florida, using a range of approaches, including learning communities, faculty professional development, and also really working hard on diversity training for faculty, they have successfully shifted their retention rates. And I think the thing to look at in that diagram, like pick the 2 orange lines. The upper orange line are the retention rates over 4 years for students that participated in the STEP program, and the lower orange line are for comparable students that were not participating in STEP. I think you can see the difference. And again, if we go down to Louisiana State, there they take advantage of a summer bridge program. Again, a lot of push on faculty professional development and a real emphasis on building mentoring for faculty, for students, for staff in a really collaborative way. Here, if you look at the light blue line at the bottom, that's the historic baseline, and you can see that prior to the STEP funding, they were right there at about the national average with about 40% retention over 4 years, and the darker blue line shows the first cohort, and you can see the significant jump that they've made in retention. You are doing great work, and it's incredibly exciting and rewarding for all of us at NSF to celebrate this progress with you. Another federal response, and again, this is something that I believe Joan will also be able to touch on during the noon hour. Across the federal agencies, there's been a coordinated effort to figure out how we can leverage our efforts, work together coherently to really have significant impact on education writ large. And I'm focusing just on the undergraduate piece. As a result, there was a 5-year strategic plan for STEM education that was released this past spring. The report, the group that issued this report was co-chaired by Joan Farini-Mundi and Leland Melvin, who has just left NASA. One of the things, again, if you look at this particular goal, it's how do you take the practices that have been shown to be effective and leverage them to improve the quality of STEM education, exactly what all of you are doing in STEP. And how do we continue to build the evidence base so we can get better at what we're doing? So here are some examples pulled from the STEP portfolio of the range of approaches, and I think in the examples I showed with you, we highlighted some of them. But it's a combination of the curricular and the co-curricular efforts that you are showing are so effective in moving the needle on persistence and retention for our undergraduate STEM majors. We also push really hard on stepping up the evidence base. You'll get tired of all of the plays on STEP, I'm sure, by the end of the morning, but it's kind of fun. I picked 3 of the examples that are in the STEP portfolio that I think are really exciting. So Alicia Dowd is looking at the pathways that Hispanic students are taking through undergraduate and graduate education and working to understand what are the practices that are supporting and ensuring success of students in this group. Sylvia Hurtado at UCLA is using a statistical modeling approach and propensity scoring. So it's actually a beautiful quasi-experimental design to tease apart how we weave together different approaches, different practices to lead to optimal outcomes in terms of STEM undergraduate success. And then at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, we're excited about a newer study that's been launched trying to dig into the financial aid question. So in this particular study, there's 2 groups of students. Students with all of their demonstrated need based on the FAFSA being met, and another group through a foundation that is providing additional financial aid, a little plus up to make it easier financially for the students and presumably decrease the amount of time they spend working outside of going to school. And so the study is looking to see what impact those 2 models have on student outcomes. So a couple resources as you begin to think about, ways you can continue to build evidence from your own program that may be valuable for you. In NSF workshop that AAAS ran and then published a really terrific report on, dug into all the different ways to describe and measure STEM teaching practices at the undergraduate level. Really interesting resource, a range of broad approaches that you might find useful. Also, in the spirit of the agencies working together to better leverage STEM undergraduate education, this past spring, the Department of Education and the National Science Foundation released these common guidelines for education, research, and development. It's an approach to try to give clear, not jargony advice on different ways and different types of research approaches that are out there, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. If you Google Common Guidelines for Education Research, it'll pop right up. Sometimes you get the NSF site first, sometimes you get the Ed site first. They both have the same report. And I suspect what you're wondering most about is, where does STEP fit in this brave new world of our improving undergraduate STEM education program? And I hope my diagram shows that all of the good work that you've been doing sits squarely in the middle of this effort. So in DOE, we're a lot like learning engineers, right? We design interventions, we design tools and strategies, and we figure out how they work. And all of our programs collectively work together to leverage that. We found there was increasingly intersections between what our TWOS PIs were doing, our wider PIs, our STEP PIs, and people were getting trapped in boxes trying to meet specific solicitations when many of the goals were overlapping. So IUS is a program that lets you out of the box and lets you do your best and most creative thinking to figure out how you can address these important goals that you're working on and bring together the different pieces, right? WIDER has pushed very, very hard on institutional change. Well, that's what you're doing in STEP also. TWOS, working on what are ways to help students learn better and more effectively. Well, that's kind of what you're doing in STEP also. So you can see how you can begin to, we hope to have more flexibility. We were very, very excited to see the response that we got with our February 4th target date. And you'll see there's other programs too, right? And many of you that I've spoken with have NOICE or STEM scholarship programs already in your portfolio, a great way to provide financial support to students that are participating in your STEP programs. The ATE's, the Advanced Technological Education Program, focuses on middle skill development, community colleges, and again, many of, especially your engineering programs, have terrific articulation agreements, moving students from 2-year to 4-year schools. There may be links with ATE for you also. And then just, I would say in a broader context, looking across the NSF, we in 2014 have been working very, very hard to figure out how to coordinate our collective efforts. We now have a common framework that we're working within. We're pushing this even harder in 2015 so that collectively we can have a more coherent approach, and that we also will be able to have much more effective ways to evaluate the impact of our investments in undergraduate education. So a little bit about IUs for those of you that haven't dug in yet. It supports improving the undergraduate STEM enterprise. We fund foundational and exploratory research. We fund design and development work. We fund scaling work within limits, right? What it would take to scale fully is beyond the scope of our budget, but there are pieces there. And proposals should build on evidence, which is what STEP proposals have always done. You've taken what we know about good STEM learning and put different pieces together in new and creative ways to continue to build the knowledge base. You heard that Peter Lee was off directing one of our ideas labs. As part of IUs and as part of our effort to really work with our colleagues across the NSF, we have 3 ideas labs going this year for the first time. They focus on very distinct disciplinary needs and ways that we can put together the best thinking within the different STEM disciplines and education and really push to move the needle. So the very first ideas lab is occurring concurrently with this meeting, and I know at NSF we're all very, very excited to see what the outcome of that is. So lots of great opportunities ahead as we collectively work to prepare a globally competitive workforce, including future teachers and a scientifically literate populace. And what it's going to take is really to continue robust research and implementing what we know works. So let me stop there, and if you have questions, I would be delighted to address them.
There are speakers here. One speaker, if you guys want to come and ask your questions.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm just interested in the balance between continuing to implement what we know works. You cited several documents that talk about, we know supplemental instruction works, bridge programs work, living learning communities work. The balance of discovering kind of more evidence, as you cited, and how we can improve learning, versus at the meeting last night of several of us, we talked about the just incredibly transformative effect our STEP funding has had on our campus, allowing us to leverage things that were there but maybe not coalescing because we didn't have the visibility of it that an NSF grant brings, the validation of federal dollars, of getting the attention of your president, your provost, the school districts in your area, that kind of thing. So I'm just wondering about the balance between that, because I'm worried a little bit when we were talking last night about IU's focusing more on that evidence base and less on maybe the kind of broad impact and implementation that we see in the STEP program.
So I think that's a really terrific question, and I think where we get into difficulties is when we put them in separate boxes. So everything you're doing when you go to implement and leverage actually has a very significant research question associated with it also. So we don't know so much about doing good implementation research. So while we're setting up these great experiments, we should be gathering evidence about what is it taking at your institution that's allowing you to be successful, and how can we capture the key elements of that so they can be ported to other institutions that want to do the same thing as you, right? In DOE, we have about $300 million total that we're able to invest every year. We can't go and set up a STEP site at every university in the country. It's not possible, right? The best we could do is buy a pencil for every undergraduate in the country with our budget, and that's not going to get us where we need to go. So for those of you that put the energy and the insight and the creativity into building these successful programs, you need to capture that and be able to share that in ways that other institutions can use that. So it's a design and development type of research, right? You're developing something, you're designing something, and you're figuring out in an iterative way how it works, why it works. With respect to your institutional change question, one of the things that has been very interesting to us is that people do not make explicit the theory of change that's motivating their work, and there are many different ones, and in the wider cadre of awardees, people were required to make their theory of change visible or to test and develop a theory of change. And most of that work is only a year underway, some of it's 2 years underway, but that more coherent thinking, again, makes it easier to tell the story and to share the work. So I hope that helps, because you need both. You also need to have people doing some of the foundational work to figure out how to keep moving forward on improving student learning experiences.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for that lovely address. It's really heartening to hear that the kinds of things that were in previous awards are going to be continued and do sit within IUSC. And I think I really like the idea of the ideas labs, but I think there's two things that might be missing in the connections, and I'd really like to hear you think about them. One is that IUSC is all undergraduate, and what STEP has shown us is that we need a continuum from K throughout, right? And actually, the decision to erase the GK-12s erased the other end of the spectrum that I think needs to continue. So focusing on undergraduates only doesn't really address our issue of creating more scientists and engineers. It might address the graduation rates, but it doesn't address the whole continuum. Are there places for that? That's question one. And question two, are idea labs going to continue, and how do we propose ones, because who do we propose them to? Because I have one I'd like us to think about, and I'd like this community to think about. And that is, there's been a development of an individual development plan and a way to find and identify your passions for graduate students and postdocs. I think that's what we need for undergraduates, and maybe even for middle school students. And there's, next question is over.
So terrific comments. I'll do it in reverse order. The Ideas Labs are an experiment that we are floating this year, and we have been delighted with the response and the engagement from our colleagues across actually all of the other directorates at the NSF. Our plan is, the first Ideas Lab is happening literally now. We're going to see what comes from that and the feedback, and really look thoughtfully if this is a good way to continue moving in 2015. The idea behind this is to do things collaboratively across the foundation, and anyone that has a great idea for an Ideas Lab, please write me, or please let your program officer know. Since we don't have a 2015 plan in place. On Monday, NSF is rolling out their 2015 part of the budget, right? The White House rolled out the larger budget earlier this week. We are just beginning to move forward in a public way on 15. So please always send your ideas, and as soon as we know which way we're able to head, we will work very hard through the STEP Central site and other ways to make sure that all of you know about that. The first question is a terrific one, right? So STEP is funded through the Division of Undergraduate Education, and we all know, right? I mean, I actually started out my life as a middle school teacher. I think we all know how important it is to think about the spectrum of education. And one of the things that has changed, I think, quite dramatically in the time I've been in education and human resources is the level of engagement across education and human resources about how we get better vertical alignment. So as you may be aware, right, we have a division of research on learning that pushes on both the P12 learning and informal science education. We have the Division of Undergraduate Education, which I presume you're familiar with since dollars are coming that way to you. We have a Division of Graduate Education, and we also have a Human Resources and Development Division, which pushes specifically on broadening participation. The 4 division directors, the deputy division directors, as well as the staff all work very closely together to figure out ways we can align programs. There are many things in engineering, there are many things that are funded through IUs that reach down into the K-12 arena, as well as being centered squarely in DUE. We do co-funding between our different divisions. Things like the STEM program, which is scholarship money, actually also supports students in master's level programs or accelerated master's programs where they're both an undergrad and a graduate student. There's a huge amount of really creative work going on in our Division of Graduate Education, rethinking what graduate education ought to look like in the coming years. Last year was the year of graduate education. We had a graduate education challenge of some cool stuff on the website if you want to look there. There's a push on how do we have more global experiences, how do we get graduate students into industry-based internships. We now have our research experiences for undergraduates. EHR coordinates that across all of the foundation. That's now co-managed by the Division of Undergraduate Education and the Division of Graduate Education, so there's good lessons learned across both. Our Scholarships for Service program was in DUE, it's moved to DGE, that's for cybersecurity scholarships that funds community college students, four-year students, graduate students, the whole spectrum, and reaches down and does some K-12 outreach. There's also the STEM-C program, which is formerly the Math Science Partnerships program, and that links high schools and universities together to figure out how to move on improving especially pre-service and in-service teacher education. So something we're really aware of, we're working hard on. If you have a project idea that spans those areas, talk to your program officer. We're pretty creative, and we would be delighted to try to find a way to work with you to get that to happen. Long-winded answer, but it was a really deep question. Did that help a little bit?
So just in terms of follow-up, clearly there's many initiatives that are ongoing at NSF, and it's wonderful to hear that, in fact, more of the division directors are sharing best practices across these programs. One of the things that I think the community continues to be challenged with is that every initiative that you might be part of, whether it's an MSP or a STEP or an I-test, has its own community of sharing, resources, networking, and those communities don't interact. And I think one thing that NSF really needs to do is to be able to encourage sharing of best practices across all of these various platforms that are being developed, because they're not unique to any one program. But that really needs to come out of NSF versus the participants themselves. It's really become a burden for many of us that are tied to many initiatives to be able to interact within the variety of platforms that are out there.
Well, that is music to my ears. One of our 2014 projects, we have a number of projects that we're sharing across EHR and working on, is to rethink what we're doing with resource networks. And one of the issues we have been struggling with is that as robust and fantastic as things like STEP Central and ATE Central and the MSP collaboratories are, and there's just as many in DRL, is exactly the point you raise. So our goal by December is to have rethought this and begin to float other ways. We're also talking a lot about doing more themed evaluation across EHR, so less specific focus on the program and more on the core goal that cuts across multiple programs. So thank you. I'm really encouraged to hear that as a community you think that might also be a valuable way to go, because that's a tough question as we struggle with it, because we know how strong your individual communities are, and we don't want to disrupt that, but we very much want to leverage and increase the communication across many communities.